Hi, I want to get started with the distributed TensorFlow. So, what distributed TensorFlow does is that they distribute the work on multiple machines or like multiple computers. We can make multiple hosts and multiple workers, or way around like a multiple like single host and a multiple workers. But just that you need to match the ratio, like amount of if the amount of workers are more, then you should increase the amount of host as well. For me, like I'm using like a local host, the same computer with different port address as an host, and the workers with the local host, same machine, this computer, and the different port. But in reality, you have to use like a different IP, local your LAN IP, or if you are hosting from the cloud or like any cloud services, you can have a public IP here. So it should be the same. For me, like I'm not doing it on the cloud. It's a small example, so I can just use local computer for me here. So this is the TensorFlow host file. In a host file, this is my main function. In a main function, I call this function distributed dist, and then I define the host. This is the host machine. I define the worker. This is the worker machine, and I create a variable called cluster. In cluster, I assign tf train cluster specs. So in the cluster specs, you have to define ps is like a parameter server and a workers, and in parameter server, this is the host which I mentioned already over here, and in the worker I define it over here. So we have a cluster with the workers and with the parameter server as a host. So now I have a variable called a server, and in the server I define tf.train.server, and I define the cluster and the job name and the tax index. For me, I'm just gonna create like one host, so it's tax 0, and what's the job name, so this is gonna be a parameter server, it's a host. So this is the simple example. So usually like for the host, you don't need to do much of the stuff, you just can define this, and on the worker, all your TensorFlow graph, your computational has to be defined in the worker. So this is the distributed TensorFlow worker, the name is over here. So I have a main function with the function called distributed dist, which is just over here, and even on the worker file you need to call the same host name with the same port, and the worker with the same localhost with the same port that I described here in the host file. And then I create the cluster specs with parameter server ps as a host and the worker as a worker over here, which I described earlier. And then I have a server now. For the server spec, I have a cluster, job name, and the tax index. Since I'm gonna just be running one worker, so I have a tax index 0 and a job name. Earlier we had a job name as a parameter server. Now this is gonna be the worker, so I define the worker over here. So we have defined everything. Now I'm gonna call MNIST train. We're gonna be using MNIST datasets for handwriting digit recognitions. So now this is the worker job, so I just print that telling the user that this is gonna be the worker job, and then I define the graph. In the graph I mentioned with tf device, tf train replica device settlers. I define like which CPU to use, which GPU to use, and then I define the cluster. The cluster is the cluster that I defined earlier over here. The cluster contains the cluster specs with host and server. So let's get back here again. Then I call read the MNIST datasets from the TensorFlow. So it's just like input data, read datasets, and I wanna store it in the temporary directory of my machine. And one hot encoding, yes, it's true. So I have a X placeholder with the data type tfflow32 and the shape none, and then 784, that's 28 by 28, and we have a Y placeholder as a data type flow32, and we have a digits from 0 to 10, so I have a number of class 10. This is the shape of the output, this is the shape of the input. So these are the basic configuration for defining the network, which I'm not gonna describe here. Well, if you wanna follow the tutorial, you can go back to the MNIST, how to train the MNIST. So uh, it's almost a similar stuff. Now comes here, like we with TF10 train monitor training session, but if you don't do distributed, we just define with TF train sessions, and we define other parameters. But for the distributed case, we have to define like a monitor training sessions with the master as a server, but server and then the target. And if it's chief, yes, and checkpoint, I want to store it in a temporary directory, and the log directory will have all the checkpointers, all the model that's gonna be saved in our like logged directory, and the hooks. So hooks is the TF train stop at step hook, and the last step's gonna be 1000, and I'm gonna be calling this as a mono session. So I have a loop over here, so loop's gonna be running while not mono hooks should stop. So I have a batch with the MNIST dataset with 50 batch per because it depends on your computer. Like if your machines have a huge amount of memory, you can use more than 50, or you can use all of the data at the same time, but which is not really recommended. And then you train the MNIST datasets over here, like monosession.run, and we have a feed dictionary with X, which is the batch 0, and the Y as a batch 1, and this is keep probe is like dropout. We're gonna be dropping out 0.5, and then our graph gonna be running. If you run, like we can run this at the beginning, because we need to run the host, and then we're gonna be running the workers. It's gonna work perfectly fine, because since we define tax index 1, so we're just gonna need to run once only. So thank you. This is how we run the distributed version of TensorFlow. Thank you.